All right, everyone, and welcome back for the final stretch of this year's Veterans Advanced Energy Summit. We're going to kick things off with a quick panel on technological innovations on the battlefield before moving to our final fireside chat of the day. And it's my absolute pleasure to introduce this first session, our sixth session, actually, which will be moderated by Deborah Kagan. Deborah is a senior advisor at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. She's also a distinguished fellow at the Transatlantic Leadership Network. And I would also be remiss if I didn't mention she has been a huge help as we at the Global Energy Center have begun thinking about a lot of these issues associated with the nexus of energy security, and defense planning. She is joined by an esteemed group of experts, including Captain Newt McKissick, Dave Belote, and Joe Miller. I'll introduce them all briefly. Captain McKissick is Senior Military Advisor for the Defense Innovation Unit's energy portfolio. Dave Belote is Manager, Partner, and CEO of DARE Strategies, LLC. And Joe Miller is the President of BWXT Advanced Technology. So let's welcome them. And Deb, I'll pass it to you to kick us off.
Great, thanks so much. So what we're hoping to do here today is to have a couple questions, and then I want to engage our panelists in a discussion and have them talk to each other as well as others here. And so I want to offer a few thoughts just to start us off. The first two industrial revolutions occurred over 2 centuries. Think about that. Now we're witnessing an industrial revolution every few months. But in the modern battle space, for those of you who've been watching Ukraine, where wars are being fought in every conceivable domain, we are witnessing a technological revolution every 2 to 3 days. It is imperative as we move forward that to facilitate how to prepare our troops, that we recognize how disruptive and how to prepare them for encompassing these conflicts are, and how they're multi-domain, they're rapid, and they change daily. And why we will have to provide energy solutions that are not connected to old-style grids and long-range transport of fossil fuels. This is a strategic challenge that needs to be addressed now, because we no longer have the kind of time we used to have for 5 or 10-year plans to find solutions. And that, I think, is going to be a critical part of our discussion today. How do we move with great speed and alacrity? We must recognize that everything we do as a fighting force will have an energy component to it. How we generate that energy, how we make it more efficient, more resilient to withstand not only climate, but the constant evolving changes in the battle space will determine whether the United States can continue to be the premier fighting force in the future. And that is why I'm so honored to moderate this panel today, because the gentlemen here are kind of like me. They're pragmatists. They don't want to talk in theoreticals. They want to get things done to change the dynamic. So they're meeting them head on with solutions, and we're going to hear some of that today. So I'd like to start with Captain McKissick, if you don't mind, because I really like to get that Pentagon perspective here about why is the Defense Innovation Unit different from previous Pentagon efforts to address these challenges? What is unique about this unit that makes it more expeditious in everything from how you do funding, contracting, your reporting chain, and how you work with the private sector to achieve solutions?
Thank you, Deborah, and thank you to the Atlantic Council for all that you do to bring awareness and to bring some real energy and traction behind these really challenging problems. I really appreciate also how you started and framed this, Deborah, with the talk about the technological revolutions that have taken place. And I'm a student of history. And as I look back, one of the books that has shaped my thoughts on this is Freedom's Forge. And it talked about essentially how we won World War II. And it wasn't solely the heroic efforts of great Americans and soldiers, sailors, Marines, and airmen that did heroic things. It was the confluence and the contribution of the industrial might that the United States was able to harness, and the innovative technologies that they were able to inject into that battle space at the right time, and that made all the difference. We find ourselves in a very similar scenario today just at a far, far accelerated pace. In 2015, Secretary Ash Carter recognized, so I think it's important also to realize how this organization got stood up, where we are, who we are, and then where we're going. So in 2015, our philosophy as the Pentagon was about efficiency. We were under the Budget Control Act. We were looking, everything we did was how do we reduce the costs associated with doing the business of what what we've been charged with. And there was some real animosity between Silicon Valley, between the commercial sector and the Department of Defense. And you think through the Snowden and Project Maven and Google and all of those things. Secretary Carter initiated and stood up Defense Innovation Unit then to build a bridge. And we call that DIU 1.0. Just plant a flag in the valley and say, hey, go and make some relationships. Figure out what they're doing right and how they're moving so fast and how do we get better. We move into 2.0, which is establishing a relationship now. Can we work together? Can we do some contracts, solve some problems, and through success beget success? We have been able to do some projects and solve some problems. Late 2023, early 2024, Secretary has now brought DIU back up to a direct report to Secretary Austin. So Doug Beck, who was a previous, he's still a naval reservist, but he is, was at Apple under Tim Cook. He is now the director of DIU. And his vision of DIU 3.0 is to partner with COCOMs, with service leads, and determine what are the major problems that exist and how do we get after the problems that we see today and move at the speed of industry, move at the speed of the commercial sector as opposed to at the speed of our traditional acquisition system. So that is DIU 3.0. Now I'll talk a little bit about how we do that and what our methodologies and what is different and why this is unique as opposed to, hey, there have been innovative task force in the past and how come they weren't successful? So we've looked at history and I'll tell you our process and what we are doing. We've been given some unique language within congressional language saying you can use other transaction authority, okay? So what that means is we can sidestep the traditional acquisition framework and the FAR-based methodologies within the business community of DoD and move to contract into prototype immediately, as opposed to sidestepping the entire requirements process. So how we do that is we essentially use this OTA capability. The COCOM, the combatant commander or the service lead says, here's my problem. They've done that through Replicator, they've done that through other projects, but they say, here is my problem, go to the commercial sector and get a solution. I'm not going to tell you how to bake the cake, I'm not going to tell you what ingredients to use. I'm just going to tell you, this is the solution that I need a solution to this problem. So our entire requirements process has now been solved because the senior leader has said so. The next step is we go through a commercial solution opening and we communicate the problem to industry and we say, industry to the commercial sector, here's our problem, how would you solve it? We take input, we give, say, 50 companies come in and we've got some that are working that I've talked to that are here. We get that opening, we get that pitch deck or inject from industry about how we would do it. We essentially take you to a Shark Tank type of methodology, phase 2, and say, how would you, we get with the leaders and say, this is how they propose it, and we're off to the races. At that point, we can issue a prototype OTA contract to start work. In an ideal world, that goes about 6 weeks into the process and we're already issuing contracts. So that is something very different. And from a pragmatist, that is something that we can actually work with at the speed of the battlefield. We have gotten support from that congressional language. That's how we started. We've also gotten support from Congress in funding. So the 2024 ask to the appropriations committees was $115 million. They said, we'll do you one better. Or actually, we'll do you 10 better. Here's over $1 billion. You've been appropriated $1 billion plus in 2024 to get after this problem. So that speeds the ability of DIU to actually put this effort into action. $1 billion isn't going to solve everything, but $1 billion does help when I'm trying to get projects moving and projects started. We are eager to go out and with our commercial engagement teams to learn the capabilities that the commercial sector is producing. And there's a feedback mechanism and loop to, hey, what is actually being produced out there? What are the commercial solutions out there to problems we didn't even know existed or to even ask for? So there's a feedback loop from industry to DoD now that didn't exist in the past. It's not in research labs, though those have value and merit, but we're looking to operate at the speed of the commercial capability and at the speed of the pacing threat.
This is excellent. Thank you so much. And I think this is a good time to turn to industry here. And Mr. Beloit, I want to do that because those of us who have been deployed, we know the issues in the battle space in terms of getting the right kind of fuel to power the fight. And we've seen failures where we didn't have that. And so you work in a great place on wind and solar. And I think it would be really interesting for me and the audience on how you do this for these long-range operations.
Well, truth in advertising at the beginning, everything that I have tried on the entrepreneurial side or these unique technologies, none of them have hit yet. So still out there trying. I'm a retired F-111 and F-16 pilot, one-time commander in Ellis Air Force Base. My group command was at Fort Hood and in Baghdad, and so I was first introduced to operational energy because I was responsible for all the battlefield airmen in Iraq. This was back 2004, 2005, first set of Iraqi elections, second Battle of Fallujah, and my team was responsible for all of the comms throughout the country, ground comms that kept JTACs, Joint Terminal Attack Controllers, talking to men and women in aircraft. My exec was a personnel officer, and he was out just doing duty on a convoy, and IEDs hit both ends of it, stalled it in between Baghdad and Fallujah. They were out there for 8 hours just protecting a bunch of petroleum. So we heard Assistant Secretary Berger talk earlier about how many Marines and soldiers died or were maimed simply protecting petroleum convoys. So I saw there, man, we need something behind the fence that is going to generate energy. We've heard about smart grids, microgrids, et cetera. My last job on active duty, I was the commander of Nellis Air Force Base out in Las Vegas. And I was also the commander of Creech Air Force Base. This is 2008, 2009. All of the ground control stations for the Predator and Reaper remotely piloted vehicles that were being flown in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Somalia were flown out of Indian Springs, Nevada. And it was, the backup power was all diesel gensets. And I'm not an engineer. I was a government and foreign affairs major who had the good fortune of talking to an Air Force recruiter during the Reagan buildup. And, if you fogged a mirror, you could go to officer training school. So off I went, got to go fly. But I'm talking to the power engineers, and they say, well, if we were to have to run these ground control stations for, 5 to 7 days on the gensets, we would probably have about a 0.7 to 0.8 probability of being able to do that. And I'm thinking, wait a second. I knew that if a lightly armed Boy Scout troop with Leatherman tools and baseball bats jumped the fence behind the Indian Springs Casino and knew exactly where to go, they could have cut the power. And we couldn't keep it going with diesel gensets, so I was first introduced to the idea of behind-the-fence solar or wind. If we come back to some of the bureaucracy stuff, I was hit in, I'm a recovering Pentagon bureaucrat, joint staff as an 06, and then SES level highly qualified expert in highly qualified expert in OSD. Anyway, we didn't have that capability. I finally escaped the gravitational pull of the Pentagon, and I am out talking to people to try to solve these problems. Well, one of the first failures that I couldn't get funded, there was a guy out in Bozeman, Montana, who had an idea to put a 5 kilowatt wind turbine and about a 10 kilowatt solar panel in a containerized shipping unit. And he actually took one to Afghanistan, and it worked. And so you've got a little 5 kilowatt, and I went to Bozeman. He had it powering Bozeman High School. That was his prototype. He did not have the patience to deal with the DoD bureaucracy. And so he's basically, his company is a residential solar installer, and we couldn't get off the ground with that particular idea. Second idea that is finally about to be deployed in India, we started 10 years ago through CERTIP ESTCP, Strategic Environmental Research and Development Program, Environmental Security Technology Certification Program, a couple of pilot programs run through the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Energy Installation and Environment. This was a really, really cool thing. Concentrating solar that the storage is in ceramic pellets. And so you are generating, electricity direct from the sun, and then overnight you are blowing air through this superheated ceramic device that gets it into a turbine, and you're generating power. We could not get that to anywhere close to a trial. So getting into the idea that DIU is producing, we've got a lot of great entrepreneurs out there with really cool ideas. We've got to get them past the Pentagon bureaucracy. And again, I say that with love as a recovering Pentagon bureaucrat. These men and women who are in the Pentagon they are smart, they are focused, they are patriotic. They don't have the time of day to devote to unique ideas. And so that's the problem we need to solve.
So let's pull that thread a little bit with Mr. Miller here, who you're looking at a technology that a lot of environmentalists fought against. I always call this, cutting off your nose to spite your face here. And even the head of the IAE had said 2 years ago that 50% of the technologies that one would need to meet climate goals have not even been invented, and 50% of them aren't going to be invented if you throw nuclear out. So we're being realistic here today. So let's talk about the small nuclear reactors and portability and safety and security, and how this can also be an integral part of the future of the battle space.
Yeah, thank you, Deborah. And you're right, the portability and transportability of power-dense systems is absolutely crucial. That's how we've been able to combat and keep peace worldwide since nuclear submarines were invented and deployed. Having that strategic deterrent has enabled the United States to keep peace worldwide. And we think about how nuclear energy can help in the future with all of the new inventions that's all very power hungry. And nuclear energy provides energy security, and energy security is national security, not just for the United States, but all of our partner nations, all of our allies. And so the good news is the Strategic Capabilities Office has invested in nuclear technology, and that nuclear technology is called Project Pele. We've been working on this project for 4.5 years. The first 2 years were competitively awarded to BWXT and 2 other companies. We ultimately won the contract to build the Project Pele reactor, and as the prime, have the balance of plant, the control system, everything that's required through our partners in Northrop Grumman and Rolls-Royce Liberty Works. So this system is being built now, and this system fits in a 20-foot ISO container and generates over 1 megawatt of electrical energy, much more thermal energy. You convert that megawatt plus of thermal energy to electrical energy through 3 other 20-foot ISO containers. So you have 4 boxes. 4 boxes power over 1 megawatt for 3 years without any logistical tie. You don't need fueling. You don't need all of the assets abroad to protect all these fueling chains. And it provides a capability that's desperately needed, because a lot of the mission scenarios now say, assume energy is always available and then go do your thing. Well, we can't assume energy is available because they're very vulnerable targets. We talked about the casualties that exist because of protecting these diesel chains. We talked about casualties that exist because we're focused on protecting tank farms that hold diesel, and diesel is going to be required. It's going to be required for decades. But how do we ramp on more power-dense systems to deploy energy to fulfill all the obligations that we have worldwide and to provide enough power and energy for what the United States needs to do, what our allies need to do, and how do we stop the encroachment of grid takeover by the Russians and Chinese? Because that's what they're doing. They're inventing nuclear all day, every day. Russia has been a prolific nuclear country just like the US has for decades. China's coming on very strong. They're investing in multiple prototypes, nearly a dozen prototypes. We're investing in one in the United States. So it's happening. And what happens is countries and islands and civilizations need electricity. It's not about money and food as much as it was in the past. It's about electricity. How do you get power to these remote locations? And so our adversaries are offering power for grid takeover. Once the grid's taken over and the power is consumed and operated by our adversaries, we know that this starts to put us in a very precarious situation as the peacekeepers worldwide. So SCO has done a very good job of making sure this program is moving forward, making sure it's done the right way. We're working with the Department of Energy. There's a regulatory body that's focused on this all day, every day. There's the Idaho National Lab focused on this all day, every day. And then BWXT is focused on this all day, every day. And we know what it takes to deliver nuclear reactors because we've delivered over 400 of them. In fact, every submarine, both fast attack and ballistic missile submarines and aircraft carriers have our products on board that provide all that energy. And the new reactors provide energy for each one of those submarines for 30 plus years of operation. So we know what the consequence of nuclear is. And we know how to track each component, each manufacturing process, the delivery of each one of those reactors, and make sure they operate safely, and they do. There's over 100 of those reactors operating safely all day, every day, and we don't hear about them, and that's a good thing because of what they do. So pushing forward into the future, I think it's really important to think about the domains, much like Admiral Rickover thought about the warfighting domain underwater, and think about the terrestrial domain and having the power that's required before it's required, using nuclear energy, and the same goes with space. We're also building a reactor for transporting a spacecraft across the cislunar volume for DARPA, because we know that's a future warfighting domain, and you can't do it with solar panels. You have to do it in space with very power-dense systems, and nuclear energy is one of those power-dense systems that the government's looking at.
So I'd like to now open this up to any of you to comment on, but a couple of thoughts based on what you said. The first is that we don't have the timelines we used to have. I go back to Ukraine because I spent a huge amount of time doing that. But the dynamic of that battle space and the multi-domain aspect of it is different than anything I ever saw. And you blink your eyes and it changes. And so the speed issue to me is critically important here. How long is it going to take to get from prototype to actual deployment? How fast can this happen? Does the DIU allow for failure? You can't have innovation without some failure. And in the past, the Pentagon used to sort of, you fail once and they throw the baby out with the bathwater. And I just don't think that's going to be a good way to approach it now. So let's talk a little bit about those intractable challenges of the people who are, and I'm a graybeard too, so I can insult them, that the graybeards are still thinking, even a decade ago, and they're not thinking of the future of how this is going to happen. So how do you get these great solutions? What is the relationship between private industry and the government that has to go forward so that you can move from idea to prototype to actual deployment? And how do you do that at light speed? So whomever wants to talk first, please jump in.
Well, you've got to get the bureaucracy to stop acting like a bureaucracy. You need to understand all of the different things and then hit the, what Clausewitzian Schwerpunkte, hit the things that are going to really make a difference. Newt mentioned, some of the reading he's done. Many, many years ago, 25 years ago, I was a SAS grad. And a couple of the key books that I remember, Winning the Last War, all of our generals and admirals got where they are because they were successful at what worked just a few years ago. And so you have to realize that it is far too easy as human beings to lean back on those issues. Another critical book in my thinking is Graham Allison's Essence of Decision, and that was written 1970, and it gives you different ways of thinking, pure politics, bureaucratic politics, and unfortunately we are influenced by politics. I did 2 years in the Pentagon in the George W. Bush administration, 2 years in Obama. And back then, we had thoughtful conversations across the top of the political bell curve. That doesn't happen as much anymore. People retreat to opposite ends of the political bell curve and scream across the top at each other, and that gets in the way. So understand all of those things, then bring these good ideas. I'm thrilled hearing what you're talking about. And I want to introduce a group to this potential Shark Tank. Someone who heard me talk like 10 years ago when I was just coming out of the Pentagon said, hey, we're trying to do this thing with perovskite, and it's a thin film, new type of solar, and you can fold it and you can roll it up and you can put it in a backpack, and then you can pull it back out and it still retains its efficiency. And I'm like, holy smoke, that is exactly what I would have loved to have had in 2004, on the outskirts of Fallujah. Well, we've got to find ways to get those ideas to you and your compatriots and avoid the bureaucracy and the rancorous politics just to solve the problem.
And if I could just add one more point here, and I saw this repeatedly over the last couple of years vis-a-vis Ukraine and even Gaza, where the old expression of most people are fighting the last war they fought. And I'm sorry, but counterinsurgency has absolutely no relevance very little relevance for what we're looking at now. So, and that, unfortunately, is the mindset of how you bring energy to the battle space as well. So if we can just really focus on that too, how do we get past that bureaucratic, stubborn streak of telling someone that it doesn't work this way anymore, and here's how we have to turn the corner?
Well, I'd like to offer that I'm really encouraged about where I sit in the scenario, because I'm a recovering budget analyst, 2 tours in the Pentagon, one of them being on Capitol Hill. So I definitely understand bureaucracy. And I spent my time there during like 2015 when we were going through sequestration and the Budget Control Act, and life was about how little can you spend? How efficient can you be? And that was the North Star. That was the priority of the Department of Defense. It was not effectiveness, it was efficiency. And we had the luxury at that time because this technological reality, we were fighting a 1970s war. We were not fighting a 2020s or looking at a 2030s war. We do not find ourselves in that scenario. And I'm really encouraged because I've got to spend time with some leaders, 3 and 4 stars who get that. From leaders like Secretary Berger, who you heard from earlier, that are pushing us. I've got a secretary pushing DIU to move faster. And now when I go and I brief 3 and 4 stars and I tell them about what DIU does, it's really interesting to see these guys and gals who have come up in this bureaucracy, and they buffer for a moment and they go, that makes too much sense. Why has that not been the way? And there's a real recognition that the acquisition architecture is not going to meet the needs of tomorrow. Not that there's not a place for it. Not that they're not fine Americans that have been doing great work. It's just that it cannot move fast enough to harness the capability gaps the capabilities and address the gaps that exist today.
Do we need an act of Congress to change this?
We already have it. To be honest with you, we already have
the legislation.
Legislation is on the books. Now, it is about utilizing it, and I'll tell you what was really interesting. When DIU discovered the language, congressional language, that allows us to do the other transaction authority, that was not written for DIU. That was written for NASA in the 70s. That language was on the books. We just recognized it and said, okay, here's a get out of jail free card. This is a way to cheat the system. Like, So I find myself from being in a budget analyst world to in the bureaucracy to the antithesis of that now, going, how do I kick down every door that I used to try to lock? Or how do I, knock down every wall that I used to build? And it's not that that those systems weren't put in place for good reasons, but I think that there is a real recognition that, and through things like what is going on in Ukraine, what is going on in the Eastern Med, what is going on in the South China Sea, we do not have the capabilities to look at this and observe it for 20 years to try to figure out what we're going to do. It is going to smack us in the face tomorrow. And there's also things, that from the energy sector that are driving us to a decision point where we can't sit back and look. There's the development of AI and the power demands that is going to have. There is the inclusion of electric vehicles and what that is going to add to the system. There's the recognition through natural disasters and things like the big freeze in Texas of, hey, this may take you off, and what is the result of that? Being offline for a long period of time. And the culmination of all those has really woken up a lot of the leadership within the Pentagon, within Capitol Hill, and pushed us. And the development, the resulting is what DIU was established to do, is to go to leaders like you who have been doing this, go to industry and say, how do we partner with you? How do we lower the barriers of entry? Because I've had some really interesting conversations about, hey, it's just too damn hard to work with the government. And if I'm dealing with a startup technology that is bringing, time travel to bear, but I can't get them through the front door because, the bureaucracy is just too damn hard. So hearing from industry going, what do we need to do better?
Yeah, I think I think it's working too, Newt, because both projects that I just talked about are OTAs, and those contracts did happen pretty rapidly. I mean, nuclear plus FAR equals infinite contracting process, right? And so I think the government's done a good job, both DARPA and NASA for Draco, and then SCO for Pele program, and then what you're doing with the DIU Army initiative, I think is really rewarding to see that, because back to Deborah's point is, getting these new power systems prototyped, I think, is the first goal. Once you get them prototyped, then you understand what the performance can be, how you deploy each one of those products, and how you rapidly, motivate industry to go out and invest in capital, invest in different infrastructure that's going to be required to mass produce each one of these products. So it can start with very small things like sensor systems and drones and AI, but it can also be very useful for energy-dense products and projects like Dan and I are working on. So I think the OTA is working, and I am optimistic that it'll continue to work, but we can't lose focus. That's the biggest issue that we have for long-range prototyping programs, is losing focus and deciding to change the requirements or change what the battlefield needs are in a monthly or even a yearly standpoint. So keeping focused on how we get energy in the battlefield, I think, is absolutely crucial, because that is the infrastructure that's most required for the future. And using the OTA process, I think, has been pretty effective, at least the last couple of years.
I have two questions to follow this on, because it's getting interesting. The first, I'm glad you raised NASA, because I think we made it to the moon faster than it takes, I won't name the service, to sign an ammunition contract. So, but let's look at this. Do we need to redefine what long range is? Do we need to redefine, because long range now, the way it used to be defined, something's going to be OBE because of the technology. And particularly in the energy sphere, that technology is just light speed, right? So do we need to redefine that? And then how do we build in mechanisms, be it software or something else, into those systems so that if they need to change, if they need to, if these energy sources are the way we deploy them are going to get jammed or something like that, is there a countermeasure? Is there EW countermeasure on this? And how do we build that into the system so that we're not retooling everything from scratch?
Well, so on that point, what I would say is two things. I'm hesitant to try to make a definition of timeline and things like that, because as we have observed, the timelines are consistently shrinking, right? And I don't know to what what the infinitum of that is. I don't know what the ends, so if I say, okay, hey, instead of 3 years, we're going to do 1 year or 3 months. Well, why does it need to be so slow even at that point? As we've seen in Ukraine, things are changing daily. So I'm resistant to putting a boundary on that, because I think anytime we put that type of regulation, it's a limiting factor, not a springboard. The other thing is you talked about how the requirements, do we need to bake that in? What I'm really excited about our model is that doesn't exist, because I've presented you a problem. We're writing a prototype contract for you to solve the problem. I didn't tell you how to bake it. I didn't tell you what materials to use. I didn't tell you how the process works. And that's where we see these giant acquisition processes like Joint Strike Fighter or whatever. We go in there and we meddle with the process at some point, or we say, hey, I need you to move it from here to here. I need this widget over here. Well, that reworks everything. So all I've done now is say, here's the problem, go solve it. So it's a design build contract, not a design bid build. You're not telling me how you're doing it. I'm not locking you into that. You are solving the problem the best way that you can. And then we're going to decide whether that prototype meets the criteria, and do we want to move further with production OTA contracts to let you build, because now you've competed, you've won, you're now off to the races, and you don't have to recompete. You've got a solution. If we want to buy it, game on.
Yeah, well, and also you've added in the commercial element to this too, right? How do these become commercially viable? So the cost of deployment isn't solely on the government, which I think is really intelligent, because energy is just as important for the government purposes, especially power dense energy, as it is for the civil use cases. So we see a lot of industrial end users coming to us and asking us when they can have microreactors for mining operations and remote oil extraction, things of that nature too. So it's almost a twofer that you get when the government leads on things like OTAs and rapid deployment models, because that rapid deployment model starts to become really appealing to different companies that have capital outlays of 5-10 years, and they need to see some return on investment in a shorter time frame than normal. So I think you do get a twofer when you behave, when DIU behaves that way, because you're not setting requirements that may distract from other use cases that are out there to help supplement not just what the government needs, but also the gross GDP, and also injecting new vitality into industries in the U.S.
So let me be more specific here, and I'm sorry to point at you here, but so if I were to say to you, what's your approximate timeline from your prototype, from your innovation to your prototype to your actual deployment, for some of the ideas and the work that you're doing now to industry?
In history, it's more than 10 years.
Right.
I've been involved with the SunZia project, and just to get a power line around White Sands Missile Range took 16 years to get permitted. And that's so you can get wind energy from eastern New Mexico to Phoenix and LA. I think, just thinking out loud, we need to relook at the requirements process, because you've nailed it. You've got the COCOMs coming to you and saying, please solve this problem. Right now, when I am dealing with folks in the Pentagon, and I came up through the 5 world, perhaps it's a difficulty that we're still in a Napoleonic structure. For Napoleon, it was only the 1 through the 4. But in my strategy and plans world, I sat in the 5 and we talked to the folks in the 8, and you just admire the problem forever. Okay, well, let's set a requirement. And when we go, with these ideas to OSD, they say, well, the services set the requirements. And so that is probably where we have to drill in. If we want to speed the Pentagon process, is figure out a way to make requirements match the problem statement, which we don't have right now. But unfortunately, all of the stuff that I've been involved with to date has been in the 5 to 10 year process. So, and we've got to, make that 5 to 10 weeks.
So isn't there a piece here where you talked about requirements from the COCOMs? And then we talked about the services, and we know the services don't always have identical contracting processes and the like. So let's look at this. What if you have a COCOM that says, I need a solution deployed in this battlefield where I am? Let's look at this. 1.3 billion people are without electricity on the planet today. And many of them are in parts of the world where we are deployed. And so we can't depend on their resources to power our forces. So just take that data point, move forward, and a COCOM says to you, I need something out here now that my enemy can't target immediately to do this, otherwise I cannot do these operations in a way that you want me to do them. So where do we go from there? How do we take that, that sort of speed where the COCOM wants us, because we're talking about lives here, and then get the services looped into this so that they also understand that it should not take 5 to 10 years from thought to deployment anymore. And I know that's what you're saying, but how do you square that circle?
Well, I think that is the process that's being implemented today, is to do exactly that. We've got projects in the Arctic that are dealing with Arctic battery technologies, microgridding capabilities, and how to power those forward operating bases. So we've got a project there. We've got development in hydrogen at the edge, development, and putting on ships and shore. We're looking at large battery systems for installations to be that tie-in between whatever production capability that exists, and how do we tie in all of that excess that we might be able to produce, whether it's wind, solar, nuclear, hydro, whatever the production capability is, natural gas, whatever, and how do we tie that in to be that stopgap? So a lot of those problems have already been said, and it's been really amazing to watch the response from the commercial sector to providing solutions for this. And one thing that I just want to put out there that I'm so excited to be here is because these are really damn hard problems, right? If it was easy, it would have been solved. And there's no group of people that is better suited to get after it than veterans. Because people in this line of work with this background understand that the difference between risk being, hey, what if I fail? Or what if this startup's not successful? That's not a life-ending problem, right? You've all experienced, far riskier scenarios than that. So your tolerance for risk may be a little different, but your audacity and your ability to go and tackle these problems. And that's the veteran mentality, and that's why I think that this group is so impactful, and that's why you all probably are so successful in your organizations. And I would love just to continue the conversation and to see where we can go from here.
So I want to take this just a little step further. I'm notorious for throwing, smoke bombs in the middle of places, but so you talk about risk, and I agree, innovation has to have risk. Are you going to start approaching this from let's deploy this now and see how it actually works out in the field? Now, I had this conversation on weapon systems recently about, isn't it better to test something out in Ukraine than it is in White Sands? It's a quantitatively different operation. So what on the energy sector, and how do you work with private industry so that you're sharing that risk so they're not just eating the risk all by themselves? How do you cover industry to make that investment go forward without them thinking they're going to lose their shirt on this? And are you willing to sort of put that out there, knowing that you're still experimental? Very similar to, I think, Navy did this with some lasers for counter-drone technology on some of the ships in the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandab. So how are we set up to do that, and how do we share that risk with industry?
Well, there's task forces, Task Force 59 that has been out there for dealing with the drone technology. There is a real recognition and desire from the fleets, from the combatant commanders, like, give it to me, let me put it into theater and see. So there is certainly that happening. There is learning that is taking place in Ukraine. There are, make no mistake, that there are things that we're doing that are learning from that. We've got embeds that are on boots on the ground there to take those lessons back to industry.
So we have about a minute left here, so I'm going to ask our gentleman from industry to do any closing comments you have here.
Yeah, I'll say from the COCOMs, your original question about the COCOMs, they all have very similar requirements for energy. And so since the requirements are similar, getting budget, getting the services to invest in that budget, I think needs to be centered around OSD. It needs to be centered around organizations like SCO and DIU, because once you solve the energy problem for one of the COCOMs, that solution can be used for several other COCOMs. And so centralizing energy, I think, is more important than other weapon systems and things like that, because the needs and the use cases are not unique or as unique. So solving that problem at a centralized level and then deploying that in the priorities that the U.S. government sets, I think, is absolutely crucial.
And build simplicity into it. Don't forget what it felt like to y'all if you were at a FOB, Afghanistan, Iraq, wherever. We can't bring out something that the specialist or the airman first class can't work. So if you are going to solve this and you're going to look for interoperable, remember Murphy is around every corner, and build as much simplicity as you possibly can.
Thank you so much, gentlemen. Thank you all for listening in today. Appreciate it. Thank you. I think we're getting the high sign. Thanks. This is exactly what I wanted. This discussion.